Good afternoon, everybody. This is Wayne Lewandowski, Senior Vice President of Sales here at ZTNA Security. I have Zachary Rogan joining me today as well, who's one of our field solution architects. Looking forward to sharing a couple ideas with you today around how prevention has a higher priority than detection and response within the cybersecurity space. First, want to thank 4Inc for also helping us put this event together today. And now I am going to turn it over to Zachary.
Thanks, Wayne. Hey, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Zachary. Like Wayne said, I'm our field solutions architect here. And I do want to look at how an ounce of cyber attack prevention is worth a pound of detection and response when looking at how do we allocate our resources. Now, first, I want to mention that this is not protection in favor of or in lieu of detection and response. So I'm not saying I'm here to take your detection and response tools and throw them out the window. We don't need them anymore because we have protection. Rather, I'm saying this is a piece of a whole. So if we look at the NIST CSF, or if we look at the CISA cybersecurity goals, protection plays a key element in both of those. And as we're going to talk about today, the threat landscape is changing such that prevention will be playing a bigger and bigger impact, particularly as we look at the impact on SLED organizations and the connection and convergence of IT, IoT, and OT. So to look at how things are today, the truth is that SLED orgs and orgs across every industry vertical really are ultimately facing more and frankly worse cyber attacks. We're seeing a higher rate of double extortion where not only are files being encrypted and then ransomed for release, but they're also being stolen and sold on black market marketplaces on the dark web or internationally. This doesn't even count, though, the number of times that organizations are hit by ransomware, pay for release, and then hit again in a kind of double attack. We're also seeing growth across the board in organizations just targeted by ransomware. We expect to see this number to keep going up. And this one probably hits hardest of all. We're seeing budgets shrinking across the board. And by shrinking, I really mean not growing in proportion to the threat landscape. We're seeing, yes, budgets are growing over time where they're staying flat, but they aren't necessarily always equipped to deal with the growing and the rise in sophistication of attacks. To that point, I would like to then posit that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of detection and response when we look at how do we allocate those ever precious budgets for our defense and our cybersecurity.
And I think, Zachary, we've seen this validated with a couple of things that maybe we'll highlight throughout this presentation, but in our own experience is many of our prospects and existing clients are using alerting and various detection systems, but it's not necessarily helping them get away from these rather sobering statistics that they're still getting hit and being ransomed.
Certainly. Yeah, we see this all the time, even unfortunately, just looking at, if you have a neighborhood kind of app on your phone, the number of video recordings of people walking off with, packages from a front porch are going up. And the video camcorders seem to not deter the criminals because they are still, and now we're just catching them stealing, but we're not able to prevent that up front. And that's kind of the context I want to look at today.
Great analogy.
The first shift that we're seeing in the attack landscape is that attackers don't break in, they log in. Now, I'm not the first person to say this. This has been said numerous times. But what I do want to highlight is that the bulk of cyber attacks are starting with compromised credentials. Now, these credentials can be obtained, again, via these kind of bulk data packages that you can buy in dark parts of the internet. These are released in breaches. These are stolen from organizations, and these are just reused common passwords. But my point here is that the attack landscape is changing, and tools that detect and monitor network break-ins, looking at how is someone slipping past our firewalls, how is someone using misconfigured pieces of our website, what do we expose to the internet? Those are fine, but those are not the primary way bad guys are getting in. Rather, we need to look at how are people logging in maliciously, and we don't have tools to monitor and detect that intent when someone logs in. Similarly, our attackers are now living off the land. This is a phrase used to describe an attack method kind of similar to the previous, where our attackers are not breaking in and then using their super cool tools. Rather, they break in and they lay low, and they are using tools and resources and misconfigured privileges that already exist within the network in order to carry out whatever kind of nefarious purpose they're working on. And why do we do this? If we think about our threat actors as just another business unit, as really a software company, then we can think of malware and exploit, either creation or research or purchasing, as a large upfront capital cost for these organizations. So they either need to go hire a bunch of programmers and research how to make these exploits themselves, or they need to go buy them from somewhere sketchy. But either way, that's a large upfront cost. And once those tools or those exploits are found and logged and put into detection tools, they lose out on those costs. So in order for bad guys, as part of their economic incentive, to increase the ROI on the kind of crime that they're trying to do, are driving their own costs down by using tools that already exist. And we're seeing this today. And this goes back to, again, that kind of point I made earlier around, yes, we can track activity that happens on our network, but how do we know when that activity is malicious? And how do we prevent when that activity, that regular pattern, becomes aggressive or has a malintent?
I think we saw this to be true. I was reading recently about the water authority attacks that have happened in states. This is Iranian-backed attacks, and what they've done is they've gained credential authority through the existing OT equipment that was on in-house, and like you said, leverage that across multiple facilities. So even a smaller state and local environment, they may not think that they're necessarily a high target, but to get that economies of scale of having an exploit work across multiple instances, this is where that would be validated on what you were just saying, right?
Absolutely. So if we look at that as what you just brought up, Wayne, as a piece, and if we kind of paint a broader picture of what a common attack patterns are happening, we can see three kind of main steps that our attackers are taking. And I want to highlight here that these are steps that they're taking to hack or attack any one organization in particular. Now, these are repeatable, so they can just copy and paste this work effort across numerous organizations. But the story for the attack goes like this. Attacker obtains some kind of credentials and logs in with valid account. This is a malicious login, but it's valid. These credentials are fine because when we look at valid account abuse, all that really is social engineering against a computer, right? We can phish, people and social engineer people to do certain things, but valid account abuse is just kind of that applied to a computer. From there, they can use the tools they have and laterally move about in the network. Their goal being find the gold, find whatever data or information or whatever havoc they're looking to cause, and then escalate privileges. And usually that's via some remote service mechanism, or usually they establish some outbound backdoor for them. But they log in, they pivot, they escalate privilege, they exfiltrate data, they ransom the remaining data that's left behind, and then they profit off of that. So if we can put a stop to credential abuse, and if we can put a stop to malicious or improper lateral movement, and if we can put a stop to abuse of remote services and escalation privileges, we can greatly reduce an attacker's ability to progress along this attack chain. And we'll dive into that a little bit deeply here in a second. But what I also want to talk about is we in the SLED organization, the SLED kind of vertical, we are a part of something bigger, right? State or a local is a part of state, state is a part of federal. All the municipalities are part of a greater water system, a greater power system, a greater transportation network. And so I want to introduce on top of these, how do you attack a single company type attacks? I want to introduce the concept of systemic cyber risk, where the attack changes from not just a single opportunistic or planned attack against a single entity to cause some nefarious purpose there, but attacks against a broader infrastructure scale in order to bring down that infrastructure, in order to leverage greater damage. And I want to talk really about, there are two kinds of systemic cyber risks or attacks that we're going to look at. One, there is a targeted systemic cyber attack, and then we'll talk next about what we're going to call spillover. But to define systemic risk really quick, I want to talk about these systemic risks impact a system, meaning they impact something on a societal scale. This is more than just, hey, did someone break in and try and shut down all my computer so they can get, $1 million in Bitcoin out of me? Rather, this is someone wants to turn off all the power for some large portion of some nation or some municipality. Um, and so the risk profile is really just changing from what if we get hacked to what if we all get hacked at once at the same time, potentially by even the same vulnerability. And we can see this highlighted in a real world recent attack on the Danish critical infrastructure. There's an organization in Denmark, Sector CERT, which published a review of the attack. But in May of this year, a threat actor attacked all the power and electrical utilities across the Danish critical infrastructure at once, bringing down the power for the entire nation. This was a coordinated attack, leveraging the fact that these organizations buy from similar vendors in order to essentially minimize the number of exploits they had to do. But the key quote that stood out to me in this was, as a result of the breach, an alarm was triggered within some scene, within some SOC somewhere. And to me, that really highlights the idea that, one, we need to look out for these systemic risks. Whose risk profile do we also match up with? And should we be talking with them to make sure that we're communicating about breaches and things that we see? But two, this was triggered as a result of the breach. The attack had already happened. They were beyond the prevention stage, and they were well into detection and response. And with looking at identity-based protection measures, this could have been mitigated.
But really, at this point, I think what you're saying, Zachary, is that when we have this designed once, used many times as an exploit, knowing that we've already passed by the detection response and it's in the environment, as you said, living off the land, if you will, it's about really putting a fence around this and minimizing the impact of said exploit.
Absolutely. It's the idea that even if someone gets in, we're going to minimize how far they can get in intentionally. Now, there's another kind of systemic risk, right? We will see more, I believe, of these targeted risks where threat actors are looking to take down big chunks of infrastructure or grids or water or business systems. But we're also going to see what we're going to call spillover cyber risk. And this is like sitting in the splash zone at SeaWorld when the whale comes by. You're not swimming in the pool with the whale, but by virtue of it going around and splashing and doing its thing, you're going to get soaked. And what I mean by this is the risk model here changes from what if we get targeted intentionally to what if someone else gets targeted, but we have a similar risk profile, we have a similar attack profile, and we're going to take collateral damage from that. Really, as organizations, all of us who buy technology from vendors across a very interconnected world, we're going to have this kind of splash or spillover impact that we're going to see from attacks on others that are going to impact us. So at a very, very broad scope, right? Not Petya and WannaCry were this, right? As these wormed their way out and got across everywhere. But we've also seen this very recently in response to some conflict in the war in the Middle East that's happening right now. Spillover into, there was noted both within a municipal water authority in the state of Texas and in the state of Pennsylvania, where because they had purchased hardware from an Israeli vendor, a threat actor who wanted to do damage to the Israeli vendor targeted all that vendor's product. Now, this water authority who probably bought this to run their SCADA system 10, 15, 20 something years ago, they're on the other side of the world. They have no stance one way or another, or really dog in the fight as far as what's going on across the world. But because they were matching the attack profile of the intended victim, by having some of the product on their network and exposed to the internet, they were also impacted.
And the same scenario could even happen where you may affect a component of a supply chain, right? So goods and services that might be supporting the citizenry of that state or local government could be impacted by somebody lower in that delivery chain.
Absolutely. I think systemic risk can be broadly categorized under supply chain risk. And yes, I think it's something that we are going to need to pay attention to even more going forward. All right, so enough with the scary stuff about what's kind of going on in the world. I do want to bring it back to, okay, there are mitigations against both these individual and these systemic type risks. And so I again want to bring up the idea that an ounce of prevention could be worth at least a pound of detection and response. So looking at this, if most attacks are now identity driven, meaning we're using stolen credentials or we're using a profile of, what kind of tech do you have, who made it, all that kind of stuff. And so therefore, these identity driven attacks are harder to detect because we can't detect malice in a login. We then need identity driven prevention to be put in place in order to mitigate these risks. Now, a lot of these are best practices, right? We're looking at separation of duties and least privilege. So even if my credentials are stolen, you can only get as far as a normal employee could get. Now, these also take into account regular insider risk, looking at how do we make sure that someone doesn't just fat finger something and turn off the power, turn off the water, right? So these have more than just active defense function or utilization as well. But the point I wanted to drive is that, okay, if we're being targeted now with identity-driven attacks and threat methods, we need to respond with identity-driven prevention, which will go a long way in mitigating these new kinds of risk. And now that's just from the technical standpoint. This also applies in a financial standpoint. Because again, mitigating budget is going to be one of the key constraints into how much of this can I get and how much risk can I allocate ahead of time. So looking at this from a financial standpoint, we can look at, we can amortize resources, right? Secure remote access allows people to be anywhere instantaneously, effectively. And so there is that kind of financial gains to be realized by just kind of the immediate deployment of people. But I also want to just talk about this at a broader scale when we look at how do we want to allocate budget. We really need to have a very honest conversation with ourselves when we talk about allocating budget towards preventative measures. And the reason we need to have this honest conversation is because it's hard to have. And the conversation needs to go like this. If we truly believe that it's a matter of when and not if we're going to be attacked, which based on what we've seen seems to be the kind of reality of the new world, then we just need to look at from just a financial standpoint, there will be a cost that gets incurred for security. And that cost either we can choose on our own to invest it upfront on preventative measures, on our own timetable, bounding and setting the scope, where everything is within our control and we can drive that to achieve what gives us the greatest not only outcome, but operational throughput through that outcome. Or we have to recognize that if we don't do that, then we're still going to pay a cost as part of our cyber plan, but that cost is going to go on the back end where we are responding reactively, and the costs and mediation no longer really become in our control. On top of that, then, right, we have to deal with whatever kind of outages may have happened, whether it's downtime or whether it's loss of service to clients, that we then have to contend with. Now, again, to pull up from the kind of scary part, funding is available in order to shore up state and local cybersecurity and really SLED level security at large. Both FEMA and then via CISA, there are many links to various cybersecurity grant programs in order to bring these kinds of preventative measures to light. Again, recognizing, I think this is driven from a broad cyber strategy that these preventative measures can have real world, good, meaningful outcomes and are worth investing in. So I do highly encourage all of y'all listening to the call to investigate how and do you apply for these grant programs and to look at what kinds of tools can these be applied towards. Now, to look at how do we mitigate systemic risk and to talk just a brief second before we wrap about what does ZTNA security do, to just talk from a continuing the thread of the earlier conversation, we need to talk about identity-centric defense. And this identity-centric defense needs to encapsulate the four kind of primary points of identity that I've outlined on the left. Those being users, and those are both internal and external users, recognizing that we are going to have vendors and contractors and OEMs and third parties on our networks in addition to our employees, and we need identities for all those user types. Applications and data play a big part of our day-to-day business, and we need to identify what are those apps and what is that data, and make sure that we're communicating with those appropriately and only when needed. And lastly, looking at machine identity, we need to look at both our traditional IT printers, servers, computers level machines, but we also need to recognize that as we add more and more IoT and OT devices, and as those networks converge, those devices need identities, and we need safeguards around who can talk to those devices and when and how to make sure that these kind of identity-driven attacks don't happen. So to sum up the broad scope of this and to provide some key takeaways, number one, I want to talk about these threat models are changing. We're seeing every organization and every vertical being targeted more each year. It is SLED as well as industry. And we need to also very truthfully recognize that budgets aren't going to match the scale and scope. Now, the response to that is that identity-based prevention is the best mitigation, not only against traditional attack patterns, against these new identity-driven attack patterns, but also against systemic risk, which we are now all a part of. And we also need to recognize, lastly, that there is a pay now versus pay later element to this. And paying now and upfront lets us be more efficient in how we allocate that, such that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of detection and response once you've already been attacked. With that, I'd like to open it up to any questions. If we don't have time to address your questions today, please feel free to email me. Wayne, do we have any questions that have been submitted?
Yes, we do. There are a couple of questions in here, and please have them funnel through. We still got about 5 or 6 minutes left in our session today. One is coming in around least privilege, Zachary. And I guess the question is, can you talk a little bit about the practical use of that? So you mentioned the who and the when. Is that something that is a persistent authority? Can it be temporary? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Great question. Yeah, least privilege access is making sure to define it broadly, making sure that a user only has access to the assets that they need to use and nothing else. These types of attacks where a threat actor maliciously logs in and then does what we call a pivot to some other resource on the network happens when there's not a least privilege access, meaning this user has access to other tools and resources on the network that they don't need. And there's a couple ways to define how do those users get access. To your kind of comment around the question, we can just limit the number of things that users need to get to when we look at remote access or when we look at network traversal and say, does this user need to go to the server? Yes or no? And if yes, they should go. If no, then they don't need to know about it. It doesn't need to exist. Their tools that they have shouldn't allow them to communicate with that device. But that's also, that really only works in a traditional kind of full-time employment type role for that user, right? If we have part-time employees or contractors or people who move around a lot, there also then needs to be a time element to least privilege access, understanding that, hey, for this case, this user needs access to some server, some asset, some machine, but maybe for only the 3 weeks that they're on the job, or maybe from 8 to 5 for the 3 weeks that they're on the job. And then once they're out of that time window, that access needs to go away. We see this a lot in firewall privileges or ruling as well, where someone makes an any rule in a firewall in order to troubleshoot something. And then due to human error, they get distracted and they forget about removing it later after their troubleshooting work is done. And that rule stays open. Things like this are kind of how we can proactively set these kind of least privilege access boundaries.
Right. And it sounds like this is a dovetail kind of off those same points, Zachary, as it sounds like this is a comparison and maybe replacement for VPN type technologies. Is that the case? And are there any other things that need to be considered in replacing what you're talking about with a current use of a VPN?
That's a great question. So VPNs are a very useful tool to have a user from one network remotely access another network. And they can do that, and they do that very well. Now, what VPNs sort of struggle to do is limit what can that user do once they've been dropped off within that network. And so to quickly contrast and a little bit of a shameless plug about what does Zage do, if I have a VPN that allows me to access some remote network, then I can access that network. And certainly you can put other measures in place to keep me from going wherever I want in that network. But if misconfigured, which is probably what a bad guy would be hoping for, if that VPN is misconfigured or if those other measures aren't in place, then once I get dropped off in the network, I have free reign. Essentially, my position on that network kind of determines my privileges on that network because I'm there. Looking at other tools like Zage or other more secure ways of accessing networks. We want to look at this from an identity-driven, also remote access standpoint, meaning not only can you get on that remote network safely and securely, but also once you're there, are these least privileges, are these separation of duties applied to that user? And can we restrict that user's movement not only through the network that they're currently physically on, but the one that they're remoting into, such that their identity is the determinant of the privileges they have on their network, not their position in that network itself.
Okay, great. Okay, that's helpful. Hopefully that answered the question. I think we got time for really one more, and it's just really overall about architecture. I think we all know this, that the security tools come in a couple different forms and fashions, and what we've talked about today from a best practices standpoint, I guess relating specifically to the Zage architecture. Agents, agentless, can you talk a little bit about that? And is this something that, is it going to take months and years to put this in place, or is it a fairly rapid time to value?
It's a great question. So again, there are merits to both ways to doing this. If you install an agent that gives you a lot of flexibility on the kinds of functions and monitoring that you can do on that machine, but that also does end up, and it can expose or increase the risk profile on that. Looking at the Zage architecture, it is an agentless architecture. And the reason the Zage tool goes that way is, again, recognizing that the number of people that need to be defended, the number of identities, I guess, that need to be defended on that network spreads beyond the employees of the network themselves. It's pretty straightforward for an IT organization to take an agent and push it to all the machines of all the employees who have company-issued laptops. No big deal. But when we start looking at kind of how work is done nowadays, and particularly in this very remote work, very mobile, transient kind of world, there are a lot of now remote connections to vendors and to OEMs. And having a central IT organization push clients and agents to all of those, and having those become and remain updated, and that can become an overhead burden. And that also then allows for where these overly permissive or misconfigured policies can happen. So to that end, when we look at how the Zage fabric is set up, it was designed that way to not have to worry about the agent side, but to still be able to manage all the different people types and identity types that are needed, with no changes to the hardware platforms.
Great. Okay. Well, that's great. And I think we're just about at time. So I want to thank you, Zachary, for the insight and suggestions that you're making today in our event. Thank all those that have attended, and for 4Inc for also supporting this event today. If you do have any additional questions or we can help in any way, Zachary's email is right there. We'll be glad to help and look forward to talking to you more. Thanks for joining us today.